I'm really delighted to be here. It's always a challenge closing a conference. I know you've had some really good presentations, and a lot of what I'm going to say has been said in different ways. But I'm glad to be here back in the Midwest. I'm from Wisconsin. I'm a reformed left-brain engineer that's spent my life trying to become cool, but my wife says that a cool Wisconsinian is an oxymoron, but I'm trying to prove her wrong. But yet Richard Florida, who was a nerdy regional planner, became Mr. Cool, so maybe anybody can do it. I'm going to talk a little bit about why the creative economy is important, and especially why it's important for the economy, and then what we've learned in some of the places we've been working. First of all, it's a confusing landscape. I'm not going to give you definitions for each of these, but they're all different. And people use them all interchangeably, and we're often comparing apples and oranges. Robert Reich once had a comment about the word competitiveness. He said, "Rarely has a term in the public discourse moved so quickly from obscurity to meaninglessness without an intervening period of comprehension." And in some ways you can apply this now to creativity. I come at it from an economic development perspective, which is about employment and enterprise. And that's why it's really important to sort of think about that, because economic development measures its changes in terms of how many people are employed and how many companies there are. And that's the way they do all their projections, their analysis, and the way they measure the success. But the creative economy is something bigger, because it's really all the people, the companies, the places that transform cultural skills and ideas and knowledge into economically productive goods and services. But the creative economy, it's about the experience, that Alessi tea kettle. I mean, Michael Graves developed that for the president of Alessi. The president of Alessi, by the way, said every kitchen ought to have art and poetry in it. And whoever thought we'd pay $175 to boil water to make tea? But people will, even though you can buy knockoffs at Target, they'll still buy the real thing, because it's the experience of having the tea. And you could take it a step farther and then pour that water into one of David Austin's teapots, and you'd have the full experience. Down on the bottom, that's the gear company. That's in one of these suburbs of Ypsilanti called Chicago. It's a gear company there. And you go on their website and they say making gears is an art, and they promote their gears as an art gallery. Or the Eames chair, or the umbrella in India. They used to make black umbrellas, and they started making them in China for $1.50. And the company was going out of business, and they started to make them as art. And they had art on the umbrella. They put music and lights into the handles, and they made walking in the rain an experience. So it's a way to it's about imagination and expressiveness. Now, as I mentioned, the first place we did it was Montana. And we were invited in by the Governor's Office of Economic Opportunity to look at the industry clusters. And that's what I'd been working on, this concept of industry clusters, how different businesses seem to cluster in certain places, like furniture in Grand Rapids, or certainly auto in Detroit, or wood products in the Upper Peninsula. We discovered they had this huge creative economy that nobody was paying much attention to, and nobody was measuring. And we convinced them, out of the 6 clusters, one of them we call the Creative Enterprise cluster, and one we call the Experience Enterprise cluster. At that time, we separated the two. And when you look at clusters, you think about them in terms of the total supplier value chains. It's a system. And those arrows are as important as what's in the boxes. It's about relationships and interdependencies among the different players, and they're all parts of it. Everything from the organizations, the social capital provides the support for it, the educational system, the suppliers, people who make the equipment, the marketing, the galleries. We also break it down into subclusters, again, because these are groups of companies that have more in common when you think about what to do about them and what kind of support system they need. Sometimes the designers, the architects, is somewhat different than the visual artists. But when you think about these subclusters, it's important to realize that they're not mutually exclusive, that you can be in more than one, and actually you would have agents not just under literary and publishing, but the entertainment industry, and some artists have agents. So there's a lot of them. You can't just add them up, but it's a way of trying to understand the industry a little better. Now, these are the sort of the reasons why it's so important. First of all, it's an undervalued source of economic growth, and I'm going to go all through these and give you some examples. and why it's a competitive advantage, why it's an attraction, and why it's a source of innovation. And I've only got 5 here. The 6th, which is the obvious one, is about education. Well, the first one, it's, why it's undervalued. It's undervalued mostly because we don't know how to count it. That economic development people, like I said, use companies and employment, and that's all taken over records of places that pay unemployment insurance. And unfortunately, in rural counties, first of all, you have suppressed data. They don't release it all. This self-employment, in a lot of these sectors, self-employment is much, much bigger than the employment, and you don't get any of the self-employment. You get people that are misreporting, that are underreporting. We've done surveys of artists and asked them, what percentage of your income do you report? And they said, you don't have to answer this, but a lot of them did. And a lot of them, a fairly large percentage are not reporting, but a much larger percentage said they're bartering. And I don't think they realize they're supposed to pay taxes on bartering. So it may be even more than we think. And of course, a lot of it is just misrepresented. That picture on the right, that's Jane Pizer, who's a potter up near Penland. Wonderful potter, makes beautiful sort of sculptures and things. And when I asked her how she classifies herself for tax purposes, she said she's in the same category as people who make sewer tiles and toilet bowls. And then I started asking all the potters and glass blowers up around where I have a house near Penland, and they're all in that category. None of them use the arts classification. So even the self-employment data misses our potters and glass blowers and probably jewelry makers and a lot of others. And also number 2, it's a competitive advantage. And when I started working, I was an engineer. I worked for GE. I worked in television receivers, which we made then. We don't make TVs anymore because they all went to China. But of course, Denmark still makes Bang & Olufsen because it's high-end design and beautiful. But basically, it was just about doing things as cheap as we could, and it's all about, like Henry Ford, give them anything, any color they want as long as it's black. And that's what it was all about. And then we got into the 80s and 90s and discovered that we were losing out to Germany, to Denmark, to Japan, and we started thinking about quality and delivery schedules, and we got into all these flexible specialization and all the Japanese methods. And then at that time, I was working a lot with the Industrial Technology Institute in Ann Arbor, thinking about industrial modernization. We all thought we had the answer if we could just get the companies to operate smarter, to make things better, that they'd be able to compete, and we would save our manufacturing sector, and did all kinds of reports on how to save manufacturing. At that time, it was, we thought we could do it. Then we sort of got to a point where all of a sudden, all of those technologies that made us competitive were ubiquitous, that everybody in the world had the skills, had the technology, and you could make them anywhere with much lower labor rates and cheaper engineers and everything else. And all of a sudden, we couldn't compete. And it wasn't about making things better, it was about somehow, for the first time, making better things. It's interesting, an old friend of mine from the Upper Peninsula, Richard Anderson, realized this really early. He was on the Northeast Economic Initiatives Corporation, and he created this exchange program with a design school in Finland, the Kuopio School of Design, to transfer students and faculty back and forth with Suomi, a 2-year college, to try to introduce art and design into the wood products industry in the Upper Peninsula. And that became Finlandia College, which it is now. But he saw early that that's the way, what we're going to have to do to compete.